Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this seminar run by the Toronto Regional Branch of the World Federalist Movement of Canada. The seminar is being recorded, as you might have noticed, and will be posted on our website in a few days. If you don't want to have your picture on the internet, turn off your camera now and mute your microphone, please. Keep your microphone muted at all times unless we ask you to speak much later in the program. My name is John Cowan. I'm a board member of the Toronto Regional Branch of the World Federalist Movement. And we're a volunteer-led organization that depends on donations to support these events and our minimal staff. I will, once Peter gets started, post a link to the website where you can provide some financial support if you're so inclined. We would appreciate it. Our branch now covers a wide area centered on Toronto, but spanning from Windsor to Belleville and Fort Erie to Sudbury. I believe the history of this area is instructive for us and the world. Before settlers arrived here, the land was home to many indigenous nations, including the Mississauga, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee. It's still home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. But before settlers came, these indigenous peoples governed their relationships under the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, binding them to share and protect the land. The dish represented the land, and the one spoon represented the people of the treaty. The treaty was to share the responsibility of ensuring the dish was never empty, which included taking care of the land and its creatures. Importantly, there was only a spoon, no knife at the table, representing that peoples of the treaty must keep the peace. So similarly, World Federalists envision the whole world as a dish, with all of humanity working cooperatively as the one spoon. World Federalists seek urgent progress in developing democratic world institutions to guide our sharing and protecting the land and its people without knives. So I'm pleased to now introduce Dr. Peter Langell, who will be talking about preventing armed conflict, putting away those knives. Dr. Langell specializes in peace and conflict studies, UN peace operations, conflict resolution and mediation, and independent analysis of defense and security policy. He wrote the initial plans and proposals for the development of a peacekeeping training center at CFB Cornwallis, served on the Canadian study entitled Towards a Rapid Deployment Capability for the United Nations, and developed the ideas and plans for a UN emergency peace service. So there's no better person to explain this idea of a UN emergency peace service. Peter's speaking to us tonight from Wakefield. Following his remarks, we'll hold a question and answer period, and we encourage you to put your questions in the chat. And Erica Wilson of the Toronto board will try to logically relay them to Peter. So, Peter, over to you.
Preventing armed conflict, finding a better way with a UN emergency peace service. Many, many thanks to John Cowan and the World Federalist Movement Canada and the Toronto branch for organizing and hosting this event, as well to many of my former colleagues at WFMC, especially Fergus Watt and Robin Collins. And thanks to all who've joined us here tonight. Last September, a global census poll found widespread skepticism that the United Nations is well prepared for the challenges of the next decade. It's not, but it should be. It might be. Prevention, as I see it, is likely to be the make or break issue for the UN. With a capacity to prevent, I think the UN would have a global constituency, political will, support, and funding to be far more effective. A UN capacity to prevent, even a modest capacity, might just be the start of a global peace system. Unfortunately for now, prevention's arguably the UN's biggest gap, its weakest link, its Achilles heel. Despite the UN Security Council having primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, the UN still lacks a dedicated capacity to respond rapidly and reliably, to prevent armed conflict, to protect people, to provide security care and help in complex emergencies. So the UN really can't deter aggression and violence except through persuasion and norms, respect for international law. And the UN can't offer any reasonable security assurance to small and middle powers. And that means it can't offer an alternative to encourage military build down and wider disarmament. Without a UN capacity to act, we've all witnessed humanitarian crises from Rwanda, Srebrenica, Libya, Syria, Sri Lanka, Yemen, Afghanistan, more recently, Myanmar, Tigray, and now the Ukraine. Conflicts which escalated and spread. Despite the promise of never again, mass atrocities happen again and again. Former UN General Assembly President Mogen Likhatov conceded the UN today remains insufficiently equipped to meet its overriding 1945 objective, to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. Now, at the risk of appearing like an old political science prof, I think I'm almost okay now. To understand the problems of prevention in the UN, we probably need to consider two related questions, just briefly, kind of like your intro to IR, but very brief. What is the problem with prevention in the international system? Most governments and officials still assume anarchy above in a competitive self-help system with no higher authority. So nation states continue to arm up and spend enormously to prepare for more war. For sovereign states, the one remaining aspect of sovereignty is in their independent control over national security, their monopoly over coercive capacity on their turf. And when sovereign states think of prevention, most think of nuclear or conventional deterrence, with military systems designed to either threaten others or destroy and kill them. Yet increasingly, people assume a global neighborhood. For over 30 years now, transnational corporations have also assumed a global market. Now, almost all our major challenges are global. Yet national security establishments combine with military industrial complexes and big money to insist they remain dominant, not the UN. Patriots, profiteers, and militarists don't want a more effective UN, global governance, or global security. And I think that's shared by at least one of the great powers. So this may appear like a time warp or a delayed, overdue process, perhaps somewhat like Antonio Gramsci's interregnum, where the old is dying, but the new cannot yet be born. The second question I want to raise is, what's the problem with prevention in the UN system? Well, the UN system's largely the sum of its parts, with the big influential part being the governments of 193 sovereign member states, which tends to make it a reflection of the international system. Unfortunately, our one global organization, the UN, hasn't been provided with the mandate or the means to be effective yet at global governance. And nor can it do a whole lot to prevent. It's not equipped for it, has no dedicated capacity to prevent. We make a lot of multilateral cooperation in the UN system, yet that often depends on acquiring a consensus. So UN reform efforts tend to be lowballed to get agreement at the level of the lowest common denominator from those usually opposed. And for 30 years, reform in the UN system is assumed to only happen with pragmatic, incremental change to existing arrangements, the tippy-toe approach. So it's usually a very slow process, one that can't adapt to deal with new developments, one that struggles to deliver on the vision, even to uphold the UN Charter. Granted, there is a shift underway to open that up and encourage new ideas, and it's very recent, which I'm going to elaborate upon later. The UN Security Council, again, primary responsibility, but the P5 members, the great powers, they still look like poachers turned gamekeepers, who still compete harshly and violently. As you've seen, geopolitical control and conquest have returned, with tension around another big war to sour the prospects for cooperation. As a result, in my opinion, we're still in a dysfunctional, war-prone system with ever higher costs and risks. We all hear calls for system change as a survival imperative now. But have you heard any calls for system change in the UN or in UN approaches for peace operations, prevention of armed conflict? Probably not. I haven't. For now, there's unfortunately very little new thinking, at least of anything substantive or promising, and even far less thinking of viable policy options to help. Perhaps the one exception being Andreas Bumel's brilliant idea of a UN Parliamentary Assembly, although that's more to encourage democracy within than capacity for prevention. With overlapping emergencies and trend lines suggesting a higher incidence of armed conflict ahead, the UN Secretary General is correct to note that there will either be a breakdown to worse or a breakthrough to better. So our trillion-dollar question, and it could be that much, is what might work to address the UN's prevention, protection, rapid response, and disarmament gaps? How could the UN be sufficiently equipped to save succeeding generations? And how might we encourage a breakthrough to better? Now, with your patience, I'm going to screen share. Oh, it's already up. So here we go. I'm not sure if you're seeing 5 different images on the side here, but it might be helpful to move them to one side. Do we have 5 faces up on the side? John?
No, it's just your spotlit. And
okay. 4 long-standing challenges drove the development and influenced the design of the UNEPS option. This began as a cooperative endeavor within the multinational initiative that included a lot of help from UN officials and experts. Near the outset, we realized a key lesson of previous experience is that favorable conditions for such a development tend to arise only in the aftermath of tragic wars or genocides. Then, when the need was evident, and it was urgent, the prior preparation of a viable plan and a core constituency of support was not. There was nothing. So this endeavor tries to ensure that both are ready and sufficiently compelling to encourage development of this peace service before emergencies overwhelm. It was primarily designed to address these 4 gaps: preventing armed conflict. We heard a lot of talk about preventing armed conflict for 30 years, since the early 1990s, but very little progress in that direction. Usually just the same calls for more early warning and more cooperation with regional organizations. And we're hearing those calls again. Clearly, the UN needs a little help on this. Second priority, protecting civilians at risk. We've heard a lot about that, especially after the responsibility to protect but not sufficient progress in operationalizing protection. Many national militaries are reluctant to play that role, and some that want that role would only be divisive. Again, the UN needs help with protection. Although rapid deployment has been an institutional priority for 30 years, UN response times have actually slowed. This system now requires 6 to 12 months or more to plan, attract national contributors, negotiate terms, find and rent equipment, arrange transport, and then deploy, which is why UN peace operations are often characterized as too little, too late. That current approach will remain slow. And similarly problematic is the UN shift to post-conflict stabilization, which doesn't really start until after the fighting stops. So rather than respond promptly to prevent situations deteriorating, conflicts tend to escalate and spread, then require later larger, longer operations at far higher costs. People are experiencing far more emergencies. I think we've got 100 million refugees now, and the UN's capacity to respond effectively is already stretched thin. In complex emergencies characterized by ongoing violence, it can be very difficult to address human needs. So one step, with this one development, a UN 911 first responder, the UN would finally have a rapid, reliable capacity to help prevent armed conflict and genocide, to protect civilians at risk, to ensure prompt startup of demanding operations, and to address human needs where others either cannot or will not. The essence of the idea is to provide timely help, hopefully to help with a breakthrough to better, because there's a little more potential in the idea than what we initially assumed. What's proposed? Providing timely help will require a standing, permanent first responder. The idea of a UN 911 seems fitting, and we're talking about a first responder. And here, most of the time, when you dial 911, you're in touch with a coherent emergency service, one that's pre-planned, available 24/7, professional, well-trained and equipped, rapid and reliable. And nobody expects a 911 service to be able to deal with every contingency. They don't bring an army or even a SWAT team, although they can also call for more help if really needed. In arriving early, though, and working to prevent worse, there tends to be far less need for more of the heavier formations. Now, UNEPS has also drawn the comparison to the sort of fire extinguisher you keep in the kitchen. It's very useful in preventing something small from becoming big and unmanageable, but it's not adequate once the whole house is ablaze. It's just a very good preventive investment. Well, to correspond to contemporary and future requirements, the UNEPS has to be multidimensional, with civilians, police, and military elements. Aside from a military formation to deter aggression and maintain security, there'd be sufficient police to restore law and order, as well as an array of civilian teams to provide essential services. To be cost effective, a UNEPS has to be multifunctional and capable of providing sophisticated responses to diverse crises. This service will really have to be busy. It'll have to be widely valued and seen as worthwhile to avoid being axed under budget pressures. With its modular structure, responses can be tailored to mission-specific requirements, depending on the needs. Deployments may be of small teams or of a complete formation. That could save a lot of money too. As this will be a new service, the UN can ensure that it's gender equitable and draws on recruited volunteers from all regions. We know that increasing the role of women in peace operations really works and improves on peace building, conflict resolution, mediation, and more. National militaries probably know this, but many are very reluctant to help with gender equity. They are very conservative institutions usually. So a UNEPS with a gender equitable composition would really be a big boost to raising standards worldwide. You look at personal recruitment and personal selection, we know there'd be no shortage of people ready and willing to help. Another objective is to develop a more legitimate, sophisticated, dedicated service. So we need to draw from not just, well, we really don't want to draw from governments and national armed forces. We want to recruit individuals who are inclined to help and dedicated and supportive of what's being done. Oops. This process is relatively familiar in the UN Secretariat and for the UN Guards. The UN simply advertises to recruit the best and brightest, most dedicated people available from around the world, then screens and selects on the basis of merit, skill, and professionalism. Those employed are then trained extensively. How would this be run? Hopefully, people would be co-located at a designated UN base under an operational static headquarters, 2 mobile mission headquarters in an integrated modular formation. Those 2 mobile field headquarters would have very similar deployable elements, allowing one to go and one to continue training or preparation as a reserve. Also, the one that stays could help a lot with the logistics and support and supply. You're now looking at the outline of a proposed operational headquarters with the offices needed to train, direct, move, deploy, and support. And you'll see small teams of experts and planners are included, mostly to coordinate the larger formation's immediate and subsequent responses, whether they're to security, humanitarian, disaster assistance, environmental, or health crises. Now, if we shift to see the deployable elements, on the left side of the screen are a relatively robust brigade group with reconnaissance units, industry, aviation, logistics, and a mobile hospital. On the right side are the police and civilian services, including teams for human rights, conflict resolution, mediation, peace building, disaster and environmental response, health and medical teams. As an integrated first responder, I think it's worth noting that a UNEPS is not limited to simply stopping direct violence, but also extends to initiating quick impact projects and long-term peace building projects. Combined with a focus on human needs, it should help to counter structural violence, exploitation and exclusion, and stem cultural violence by including specialists in conflict resolution, mediation, human rights, peace building. There's a far better prospect of stemming or solving a crisis. Hopefully, then you don't need to follow on rotation of multinational forces. Why this model? I think it corresponds to and meets the probable requirements of UN missions. It does cut the pressure on a lot of the national governments who are very averse to deploying their people at the outset of a crisis. And yeah, it includes several useful services with incentives for cooperation and disincentives to stop or deter violence. Again, it's intended to deliver more assistance faster in a more sophisticated manner. To complement existing arrangements by deploying rapidly for up to 6 months until the problem's resolved, or until governments are ready to offer multinational contingents. Now, you're into what some view as the impediment, but I don't think it is that much. The startup or development cost of a UNEPS, likely around 3.5 billion, may appear very large, but that's likely to be shared among 193 member states. When put in the context of global military spending that seldom prevents much, a UNEPS costs a fraction, just 1% of the Pentagon budget. Here are governments planning to build 15 Navy frigates at a cost of, well, around $5 billion each. So the total cost of a UNEPS for 193 countries is less than the cost of one Canadian ship. Whoops. A UNEPS would not only help to prevent the escalation of volatile conflicts and deter groups from armed violence, it could also drastically cut the size, the length, and the frequency of UN peace operations. And if it helped to reduce just one of those 5, it would be a very cost-effective, smart investment. So this ounce of prevention would be worth a ton of cure. I think that's worth repeating. As early as 1961, the US State Department saw the potential to reduce national armaments and rely on a UN peace force. In that light, UNEPS could be a vital aspect of progressive peace and global governance efforts. Increasingly, it's understood that progress in wider disarmament, even in the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, depends on a coherent alternative to nuclear and conventional deterrence. Right. Similarly, the security dilemma driving numerous states to arm up in response to anarchy above and uncertainty over tough neighbors, that can only be offset by a UN assurance of support. For both, the alternative need not be similar to what exists, large or powerfully destructive. It needs to be credible, respected, and widely valued. With a UNEPS, the UN would have an emergency security provider, and governments would have an additional incentive for military build-down. Wider disarmament should be considerably easier without the anarchy above and fears of tough neighbors. So this might build trust and confidence, even further cooperation. An emergency security provider, in that respect, the likely roles of a UNEPS would be similar to that of a first responder, a tripwire. a vanguard, and a standing presence to dissuade, deter, and respond rapidly if necessary. The minimal deterrent and modest military capacity within are appropriate and likely to be adequate. A UNEPS does not need heavy military elements or a capacity for mid to high intensity warfighting. In representing the international community, it's unlikely to encounter violent resistance from any national armed force. And if it did, well, the P5 are likely to still retain some capacity in that area to help. It would probably have to have an assurance of augmentation and support in the event it's deployed, every time it's deployed. But again, I think we see the potential to have countries scale back on preparing for more war at ever higher costs and risks. And similarly, the military-industrial complex, their unwarranted influence and control over governments, that would drop and decline rapidly. Then the UN and governments worldwide would have the resources needed to address our climate emergency, poverty reduction, sustainable development. What other benefits? Well, it's no panacea or cure-all, but it's a new approach to help with a more effective UN. Peace operations should also improve with a UN first responder. I'm very keen on the idea of encouraging more prompt care and help. I think that's within this too. There's arguably, that's a step towards saving succeeding generations. And it might even be a step toward an overdue shift from a crappy war-prone system to a UN-centered global peace system that might yet free up resources to help with really heavy pressing challenges. Even the P5 is going to have to consider that. Soon confronted with a survival imperative, they will also be searching for viable policy options. And a big joint project, such as a UNEPS, might appeal as a win-win option for addressing their shared collective interests. I think cooperation, well, the future, if there is to be one, will really depend on cooperation, and they know it too. Now, that's just an encouraging assessment that arose from one earlier global conference. At least it may demonstrate the potential to move the idea up wider and higher. What's encouraging lately? Well, we had two powerful precedents that suggested a UNEPS might save millions of lives and billions of dollars from US House of Representatives. British Labour Party also liked the idea, and they heard very encouraging responses in their bilateral consultations over the idea. We have a new UNEPS NGO network of 10 partners, and I'm hugely thankful that the proposals made it up in the UN to those drafting their forthcoming agenda for peace. So UNEPS might yet be a game changer if the idea tips toward attracting further support and solidarity. If these encouraging precedents can be followed up on with further efforts. Thankfully, a few in the UN now know of the idea, but we also know that it doesn't stand a chance of being considered in an agenda for peace unless we can raise its profile, encourage wider, higher support among the member states, interest senior UN officials, the media, and civil society. Again, that really depends on if a miserably long volunteer slog can be shifted to more viable and effective basis with sufficient resources to do the work required. How to help? Well, I'll tell you, one big shift just occurred that also provides some hope here. Over the past month, the UN's experts, the gatekeepers of conventional wisdom, were advising us that there was no chance of any major change arising in the UN agenda for peace. And civil society had already weighed in with proposals that would make little, if any, difference. For UNEPS, me, and a few others, the cause appeared almost lost and over. Also partially because of that old official preference for pragmatic incremental steps, which does foreclose on raising any big, bold idea. But finally, thankfully, someone serious in the Secretariat realized the dilemma of a UN without anything substantive to raise in an agenda for peace. Now, wouldn't that seem really odd in the middle of a great power war with overlapping emergencies while the Secretary General is calling for system change worldwide? So with nothing worth raising yet, nothing to inspire, thankfully officials shifted to delay both the Summit of the Future and an agenda for peace for a year until September of 2024. And they've also shifted the focus, much the same time, now even calling for a paradigm shift, which opens the door to bigger, more ambitious ideas. So we do have a little more time to be prepared and a lot to do. Oops, I think I missed something. Yeah, how to help. Well, to date, there's been a sense that this is pretty well mission impossible and that I'm beating a dead horse, which leads a few to ridicule and walk away, or to wish an American NGO might appropriate the idea again to do the job decently. With support and solidarity, I still think this initiative might make a world of difference, that it has the potential to be a game changer. Obviously, we need help to make this happen. And I think you know of others who might help. So please feel free to circulate the idea. Feel free to copy and share any UNEPS article or information within your networks. If you may be up on and aware of social media, please send me an email and I'd be happy to provide a message. If you may know people in the UN, in government, in media who might be inclined, please share their contact information or just ask them. Here, we don't have any money to continue this work. And so far, the foundation world hasn't offered any help. So if by chance you might know someone with deep pockets, just either ask if they're interested, or send me their email and I'll ask. For now, the urgent need for change is up against the political will to maintain business as usual and keep the old game alive. Yet you also know that the future, if there is to be one, it's going to depend on cooperation and system change. And paradigm shifts do happen when prevailing systems are deemed inadequate or failing, and when another option is widely viewed as better. I think a UNEPS offers a breakthrough to better, and it may yet be a game changer. As William Fry observed in his 1957 seminal study of a UN peace force, that which is radical one year can become conservative and accepted the next. That's what we really have to do with this initiative. That which is radical one year, UNEPS, has a chance next year. Many thanks to John Cowan, to the World Federalist Movement Canada, Toronto branch. Many thanks to everyone who sat in and listened. It's over to you. I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Peter. And I'm going to ask Erica, one of our board members in the Toronto branch, to convene questions and So encourage people, first of all, to put questions in the chat. I think that's the easiest way to police the questions for now. And Erica, over to you. Is there an opening question that you've got, or that?
Sure, yeah, we'll give people some time to put stuff in the chat, but for now, thank you so much for that presentation, Peter. That was really wonderful. Our first question comes from Norbert. So in territories such as Donbass and Kashmir, the present and current future lives of people of the land is determined by people outside the land. So Moscow and Kiev in the case of Donbass. Does UNEPS envision a mechanism, procedures, and structure to facilitate discussions by people of the land to settle their differences, as was done in, for instance, Northern Ireland? And once that dialogue is completed, could UNEPS conduct free and fair elections, perhaps with proportional representation within that territory, so the entire population is party to the negotiated settlement?
I think the short answer is no within UNEPS. The UN itself has the capacity to facilitate the dialogue and to run elections, and they're really quite good at it. But that isn't what I'd view as a key essential role of a first responder for preventing armed conflict. Thank you.
Our first question comes from the chat, comes from Bruce Robertson. What is the Canadian government's openness to this idea?
Good question. I wonder as well. The idea actually stemmed from a Canadian report that John kindly mentioned at the outset, towards a rapid reaction capacity for the United Nations in 1995. It was presented to the UN General Assembly, and within the report, they said if none of our steps for the short to midterm work, we're going to have to come back to this idea. But did they? No. Has the Prime Minister's office responded to this? He's been asked. No. Has Ambassador Bob Rae responded to this? He's been asked. No. A very strange response came from the Minister of Foreign Affairs, who said, we're doing so much wonderful in the peacekeeping field, peace operations, but I couldn't identify one thing there that had made any substantive difference in any respect. I thought it was pretty pathetic, and still do. You know, we were once leaders in this field, not just in deploying large numbers of Canadian forces abroad, but also in having the ideas and initiatives to make a difference. And we have dropped that ball so pathetically that I'm kind of ashamed of this government.
It is a cornerstone of the Canadian identity to sort of uphold our peacekeeping. So I understand that frustration.
You know, it's a great identity too. I had kids who, you know, they learned to be peacekeepers in a schoolyard instead of being bullies. So it, you know, I think peacekeeping helped us develop our own culture of peace somewhat, and that we're losing it, well, it's depressing. But I know Walter and Fergus and Robin and quite a few others have gone far further than I have, trying to encourage it back. And it's a tough one at the moment because, well, our foreign policy is really, as I see it, directed by NATO, and we have dropped the UN. And I don't see the capacity within Global Affairs Canada, within the Prime Minister's office, within National Defence, that's either inclined or capable of reinvigorating UN peace operations. So, and no, NATO won't be asking us to do more of this.
Our next question from the chat comes from Walter. The UN has created a standing police capacity based in Italy. Do you know how this has gone, and could it be considered a step towards UNEPS?
Yeah, studied it and consulted with the police capacity, both in the Department of Peace Operations and in Brindisi. And they started, I think, with 51 officers. And they were under such, and they were doing a wonderful job. They were celebrated as doing exceptional work. But that's partially why I determined that UNEPS had to be multifunctional, because they were being cut and losing positions almost yearly. And even though the reviews were raving and great work and they were needed, those people I spoke to mentioned that they were currently paying their way into missions by themselves because the UN wouldn't foot the bill. Well, the mission itself wouldn't foot the bill. So is this a segue into a larger?
We have
Yeah.
I think this is a
No.
really good segue into the next question, actually. Also from the chat. Can you advise a brief history of where opposition to this proposal has come from? In particular, from the P5, how do you see overcoming this opposition?
Well, you know, there has been both opposition and support. At the end of the last Cold War in 1992, 91, 92, 4 of the P5 members were in favor of a UN standing rapid reaction capacity. You know, they had different visions of it, but they didn't agree on it. So, you know, it goes up and down. But, you know, who is most likely to oppose at the moment? I don't want to burn bridges, but I gather the Americans of the Biden administration has already informed the UN Secretariat that they don't foresee a UN-centered world order. Strangely, Russia and China have both proposed a UN-centered world order. I already see an effort somewhat from the State Department and NATO to scale back on the agenda for peace. And I think that's an indication that that's the primary opposition. It's from the military-industrial complex. And American administrations may change. There are some very influential people in the United States who like this idea, even some who may be running for leadership. And, you know, it did go up before President Obama and Hillary Clinton in 2008. Hillary Clinton said maybe to UNEPS, and Obama said no outright. So most of the American support walked away. They just cut and ran.
That's interesting. This is my question. I thought of thinking about this because in your presentation, you brought up the UN Parliamentary Assembly and various propositions to make our UN institutions more democratic. Do you foresee that those democratic reforms are necessary to take place prior to UNEPS? Is there a possibility UNEPS could occur before it? Yeah, okay. Why is that the case?
Our make or break year is next year. If this idea doesn't manage to impress anyone working on an agenda for peace, and if there isn't higher support from a member state and senior UN officials, I don't want to say I'd give up, but I'm done. I'm tired and old and broke, which doesn't make it easy to run something of this nature. And you know, the energy has to be, for me, it has to be focused on this year, next year, and 2024 for that Summit of the Future and the release of an agenda for peace. But I don't think that a UN Parliamentary Assembly is going to weigh in on this and make it happen.
Okay.
Although I really support the idea.
Yes, it would be wonderful to have a more democratic UN. This next question is from Norbert Casa. Could UNEPS get involved in conflicts that are already underway?
Yes. Yeah, there. That's
How
not
would
the
that proposal
ideal.
go? Yeah.
That's not the ideal. It would be a tough one to insert it within an ongoing war. But people ask me this about the Syrian war and a few others, and even the Ukraine war. And you could foresee how, if the UN had a capacity to help with humanitarian corridors, set up safe zones, monitor and patrol a region that they wanted demilitarized, this could be very helpful in that respect, but not as a warfighting element. It's could it have stopped the Russian army? No. Would it have stopped the Americans? No.
So prior to conflict.
It's best prior to conflict. It's a preventive deployment measure, and it's something that could be helpful after wars start, but hopefully after a peace agreement's negotiated and a peace process is underway, and there's a need to separate belligerents, to put in a tripwire of sorts to keep them apart, and to monitor and even enforce a safe haven.
Our next question is an interesting logistics question. So as with all first responder activities, there is a handoff issue. There is a handoff that tends to occur once the situation is more stabilized. What would be the challenges of this kind of handoff for UNEPS to another sort of organization? Would it be encompassed in UNEPS?
No, it wouldn't be encompassed within UNEPS. I think if there was a handoff, the normal procedure within a UN peace operation, which UNEPS would be part of, is a rotation after 6 months toward another contingent, another multinational contingent. And as UNEPS is really a first in, first out service with a maximum deployment time of 6 months, I think it's not so, it's not anything new that UNEPS would simply try to establish the basis for a very smooth transition and then allow multinational contingents to gradually move in and take over as it would withdraw. That's not a problem that I see as insurmountable at all. Thank you.
I think that speaks as well. There is a concern of the militarization of the peace process. How do you think UNEPS addresses that concern?
Discreetly, modestly, but there is another concern. One of the major sources of opposition to UNEPS has come from the nonviolent civilian peace force, the unarmed community that try to have a influence in different conflicts worldwide. And they're very upset that I'd even consider having military elements within. But I don't think they've ever deployed into anything which was hot and volatile. And how goes it if you encounter the Rwandan Interahamwe, if you bump into the Bosnian Tigers, if you are up against ISIS or the Tatmadaw in Myanmar, or any one of dozens of very heavily armed, desperate groups? Well, then you're asking people to commit suicide, and or to become cheerleaders on the sideline of a conflict that have no influence. So yeah, I think UNEPS is intended for a tougher job. I don't want to really diminish the need for nonviolence. I think it's very respectable, but they should be working as complementary steps, not in opposition. They're not. I don't view UNEPS as opposed to them, but I'm fearful they are opposed to us.
And I do think concepts like 6 months max deployment, it lends to that. Their role is to be mediators. So this is sort of related. This one again comes from Dr. Walter Dorn. Under what circumstances would UNEPS use armed force? For example, engage in armed combat?
Much the same as UN peace operation would. In defense of the mission, in defense of civilians, protection of civilians, protection of their people. Occasionally, UN operations have gone on the offensive, but only at a tactical level. It's never been much more than that. Well, maybe with the exception of the earlier MONUC in the Congo, but that's rare. This isn't an enforcement capability of a large-scale nature. It does have a capacity for self-defense, but if you look at really what's projected in the kit side for those two military brigade groups, they don't even carry artillery, and a lot of peacekeepers would think that's a liability, but I view it almost as an asset. You're not bringing in much in the way of an offensive capacity. I'm a very strong believer in minimal deterrence, and I guess I've lived it. I think if you're useful, helpful, and you have a robust capacity to look after yourself such that you're respected and credible, you can do a lot. Thank you.
Along those same lines, humanitarian ops have come under attack in some places. Could UNEPS provide protection to those guns?
Yes, I would think so. If there was authorization to deploy it, I don't see any. I have no reservation whatsoever about coming to the assistance of humanitarian operations, especially UN authorized humanitarian operations. That strikes me as eminently reasonable. Thanks.
Two sort of related questions, both from John Cowan. I think that relate to, again, the last question. What UN action would be needed to deploy UNEPS? And then this is the other one I think is interesting, is why the 6-month maximum term? And I'll let you answer those in whatever order you feel fit.
Well, a UNEPS could only be deployed after authorization by the UN Security Council. That unfortunately is how this UN works. They maintain primary responsibility, they authorize, they mandate. And that seems likely to be the case for the foreseeable future. There's a wider discussion ongoing about whether the General Assembly could play a wider role. And I'm in favor of the discussion, but I don't think that changes this proposal. Your second question, help me out.
Oh, the 6 month.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, 6 months is the usual rotation period in a UN operation. And as a first responder that's intended to be rapid and reliable, you're not going heavy. You're the first in. And so you'll likely be there before too much of a camp is even set up. Almost all rapid deployment systems worldwide have a very strict limit on the time they're allowed to be sent. And things begin to get thin after months 4 and 5. So I'm not at all worried that we have a 6-month maximum That allows member states to get ready for the operation if they're inclined to contribute. They have a few months to train and prepare and negotiate the terms. And governments, I think, would actually find this almost a relief that, there was a UN presence that was competent for 6 months till they were ready. The pressure would be off many governments. Even some in the north might contribute for a change. Because all governments look at the risks in the initial 6 months and then they go, ooh, too much for our people or our valued equipment. We don't think we can do it, especially in the north. In the south, they're a little more inclined to help. Although their capacity to help is a little less than those in the north. But we'll see. Thank you.
For the next question, we're going to bring it back to the UNGA. So this one comes from Fergus Watt. The UN General Assembly's role in peace and security is increasing, and the case for a UNEPS includes areas of humanitarian and other emergencies that are also the purview of the GA. Is there any scenario for a UNEPS that is created by / reports to the GA or a body like the Peace Building Commission?
I'm sorry, I need to hear that again. I apologize.
Is there any scenario for UNEPS that is created by or reports to the General Assembly or a body similar, like the Peace Building Commission? Do you foresee that as an avenue for the creation of UNEPS?
No, at least I haven't to date. I'll have to consider it more fully. The question's interesting, but we have not addressed it. And well, I'm a bit surprised. Authorization from the General Assembly.
What avenue do you currently see as the most likely for UNEPS coming to fruition?
I would foresee the UN Agenda for Peace as by far and away the most likely to at least announce the, or even if they don't announce the development of it, they could conceivably announce a serious study, a committee to review it, and then assess whether its weaknesses or strengths were such that they should proceed. It's also conceivable that even the Security Council in the next several years, and I suspect they will also be in a panic, looking for what to do given the mess they've created. And if that happens and someone thoughtful has a viable policy option to help, it'll come up, but the challenge is reaching those, within the Security Council, or it's challenges reaching half of the senior officials in the UN. I don't have their contacts. I have a few, but we have seen endorsements from former Undersecretary Generals of the United Nations. We've got a long list of prominent endorsements from very thoughtful people worldwide. But have any of them really put their heart and soul into helping? No. That's the same with the NGO community. It's not been much.
Our next question again comes from John Cowan. Could UNEPS operations be seen as Pacific? So theoretically, an involved country cannot veto deployment.
Could UN operations be perceived as Pacific?
Under Article 6. So cannot be vetoed by the country that is involved.
Good question. I'm not sure. The UN has run one preventive deployment back in 1995, and it was a very successful one. It's probably credited with stopping a wider war in the Balkans. It was called UNPREDEP, and but I think it was authorized under Chapter 6, if not Chapter 7. And almost all UN peace operations since 1999 have been authorized under Chapter 7, which allows for all necessary means. Sorry?
This next question relates to the process, which I do think is an interesting part of your proposal. So the first part is, would UNEPS be doing negotiations to avoid conflict? But I believe that is correct. The second part is, in that case, what would happen in situations where you would need longer than 6 months for those negotiations and mediation processes?
Well, you simply hand off to the people who are rotating into the operation, much the same as you do in all UN peace operations. And hopefully you have established the groundwork for more successful follow-on efforts, and hopefully you've even started the peace building quick impact projects. You've got some people working on conflict resolution and negotiating a better peace process, and you've calmed off the community sufficiently such that they're back to being secure and viable and governing increasingly by themselves. Then you can even start to plan things like elections. And I wouldn't think that there's any reason to foreclose on not having others with expertise in that fly in and start to set up that process while UNEPS is there.
But if in the 6 month period, there's a settling period where you're familiarizing yourself with the players of a conflict, and it's indicating that a transitional period might be detrimental toward the progress that you've already created through this 6 months of having negotiation and mediation experts. How do you foresee that handoff going? Does the handoff proceed? Do you have an extension of this mediation period? Because again, conflicts are, they'll be new to the people stepping into the frame, but they're deeply rooted in local histories often in the places that UNEPS would be deployed. So I think that transitional period is something that would be something of interest for those who are considering UNEPS as a peace possibility.
Well, those transitional periods are rather carefully planned by the UN already. And when there are people negotiating and discussing, they're usually either brought in, the new team comes in and there's a extensive period of briefing and review and assessment of where there are potential problems and potential opportunities, and it's not like a cold handoff. They work together extensively for over a month, and sometimes they're key people in each area will be joining an operation for 3 months of being 3 months ahead of when that rotation is pulled out. So I don't think there's anything terribly abrupt here. But it's thoughtful, and I'll give it more thought. Thank you.
I really like this question from Patricia Phillip. A lot of what you've spoken about really resonates. And for those who believe that UNEPS is the correct path towards peace, how in conversations with friends, colleagues, and any other people you may be discussing this topic with, what do you foresee as the most effective way to convince people that UNEPS is the ideal path towards global peace? The most convincing lines in your experience.
Oh, you mean the elevator pitch? With this one
Sure.
development, a UN emergency peace service, we'd have a capacity to prevent armed conflict, protect people, respond rapidly to crises, and facilitate wider disarmament. And, it doesn't hurt to pass out a pamphlet or an article and share it around. But, my sense is, although I'm not usually captured by a new term or a marketing angle, the notion of a game changer is rather important now. And I've used it in a few recent articles. I think it's correct. I don't want to say it's revolutionary. Not well, my son and daughter might listen to that, but most of you wouldn't. And that might even burn a bridge. One idea has tremendous potential to change when it's most needed, and urgently, soon, or else.
I have another question I recall from hearing the presentation. Was there a case study that did not have something like UNEPS that you felt, had there been a service like this, it could have really turned the situation around in a way that current structures could not have?
Was there a case study? Well, we've done case studies on UNEPS and how they could have turned around different operations. And, several of us, from very different perspectives, not knowing one another, reviewed Darfur. And that appeared to be a very useful case, although it had some complications attached to it too. Almost every conflict that comes up now, we do an assessment as to whether UNEPS could help. And, even at the outset of the Ukraine war, I was being pestered by one to say definitively, could it work, could it not? And, well, there are a lot of caveats there, Obviously, it would have been vetoed by the Russians, if not the Americans. But I don't have an immediate answer aside from saying that, having looked at conflicts since Rwanda, well, Romeo Dallaire told us 5,000 decent, well-armed troops could have stopped the genocide and killing of 900,000 people. And if you look at what happened after Rwanda into the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where close to 9 million died, with some of the same actors involved, UNEPS could have probably prevented both of those. Could it have stopped Srebrenica if it was available? Yes. But these are hypotheticals, and I don't know that they altogether take us that much further forward. I would like to see something done in Myanmar and Tigray and Yemen. No shortage of areas where I think this could be hugely helpful. And it doesn't even have to deploy to be helpful. The key thing about any police or defense effort isn't that they're always deployed, it's that you have an available presence that actually deters. And it puts it in the back of anyone's mind who has aggressive ambitions, that they might actually be punished for it or caught, or that the law might catch up to them. And in some respects, I guess I view this as a mechanism of international law. And we don't have enough that's slowing down this culture of impunity. So I would hope to think that I've seen a lot of conflicts that I desperately wish there might be some option to help with, and it's frustrating over time. I know that.
I think we're,
Peter, Erica is telling me that we've expired on the written chat. We still seem to be holding many people, so maybe we could open the floor to people raising their hand with the raise hand function if they want to ask a question personally, but I'd plead that they not make speeches, rather come to the point with a question. And I'll try to just watch and organize the answering or the asking of questions in the sequence that they are asked. If you don't know the raise hand function, it's at the bottom of your screen under reactions. Please raise your hand if you have a question that you want to ask verbally. And I see Fergus, and then I see Shane so far. So let me try to just back out here and leave it to, and I think I will remove the spotlight on Peter so I can see everybody properly. Fergus.
Thanks, John. And I just want to weigh in with some compliments. First of all, to the Toronto branch for the event. I mean, this is the idea of a UNEPS is, as Peter included in his presentation, is not new, and it's a quintessential world federalist idea that really demonstrates practical utility for our some of our ideas, so all credit to the Toronto branch for organizing the event, and you know, as many will know, that I've you know, had a long period as a staff member of the World Federalists, and to be sure, this isn't the first time I've heard a presentation on UNEPS. Peter received an award from the organization, the Hannah Newcomb Award, which recognized you know, dedication to the ideals and principles of world federalism over a career or a lifetime, and that was you know, one of the occasions, one of many times that we've heard him speak, and you know, we've been in touch over the years. But I must say that I was impressed tonight because it's clear that from the presentation that you know, Peter's keeping his ideas current, and there's a lot that's tailored to the present situation and the you know, the thinking around UNEPS has evolved. It's not just Peter's thinking and Peter's work, but Peter is a, you know, a bit of a treasure in that he's one of the global experts on this idea of standing capacity for the UN to do peacekeeping and other forms of early intervention and protection. So I just wanted to say that and hope that this you know, now that I'm no longer have a role in the organization, that you know, that this idea remains as part of our dogma and our ideals going forward. You know, I can say, I mean, I'm now working on as part of the civil society coalition that's focused on this Our Common Agenda process, which includes the proposed agenda for peace, and you know, one thing that Peter did say that I would want to maybe not correct, but just add to is that civil society's engagement with an agenda for peace in this process, now that it's been delayed to 2024, hasn't largely it's only begun. I mean, so the comment that civil society is in favor of sort of prevention and tippy-toe and small steps really hasn't been tested, because what we've found in the coalition is that most NGOs in a UN context are kind of swimming in their lanes, pursuing humanitarian work or human rights work or gender or whatever they're focused on, and they need to be kind of drawn to the table on the OCA, and that kind of convening is what we're in business to do. But we're still in early days, and so there's most people who are familiar with UN multilateral processes know that there's a lot that a lot of the outcome happens not at the summit or just before the summit, but in the long weeks and months and years, in some cases, of preparations leading up to them. So we shouldn't assume that some of the bigger ideas, and this is certainly a big idea, is some of them are not not possible or can't be raised. That's not to say that they will be raised. I'm just saying that we're at an open process in a UN reform moment leading to 2024, and we shall see. So it's a good time. Yet again, this is another reason why it's a good time to be having a discussion like this. Sorry for speaking so long, John.
So Fergus, that wasn't a question, but it prompts me to ask what looks like the last question, because I don't see any other hands, and that is, Peter, what do you know World Federalist Movement well? What do you think our next move as the World Federalist Movement of Canada should be on this?
Asking me. Oh.
Yeah.
If it was possible, I'd love to see a dedicated day-long forum in Ottawa inviting members of Parliament, especially those working around foreign defense, development. And to date, we haven't had really any interest from a Canadian political party that's substantive. A couple of years ago, Fergus arranged a very thoughtful pre-election question asking the parties whether they might be inclined. And I think, well, to his credit, he had the NDP and the Green Party say yes, but that we didn't manage to generate traction around it. And unfortunately, it didn't capture media attention and didn't push them to do anything more. It would be lovely if we had a member of Parliament, semi-progressive, who was inclined to raise a private member's bill. And that may even be possible through either your branch or World Federalist Canada.
Is there a particular MP that we might focus on?
I haven't thought of who specifically lately. I have asked several people who, well, they didn't respond. Several members of Parliament.
Okay, well, if you think
if
you think of one, could you let us know?
I mean, yes, I will, and I think
You've
could
thrown
think
down
of
the
one.
gauntlet here. You've sort of given us the task.
Well, look, Shane and Fergus know parliamentarians better than I do, I'm sure. And the Ottawa branch has lots of people and it's had former members of Parliament participate. Arranging a private member's bill is not that tough, and this isn't all that radical. And by next year, it won't be radical at all.
Right.
Worthwhile, but it's a great question. What more could be done? I know none of us have deep pockets and can kind of finance an initiative, but occasionally we know people who do. And without their support, it's very tough. But, you know, I guess I don't have the answer to the $1 trillion question.
Okay, thanks.
Just an idea.
I see Shane Roberts has his hand up, and maybe he'll have the last word before I turn it over to Norbert.
Actually, it was good following last, because I've got a point I want to throw to you that would maybe kill two birds with one stone. And I'm thinking of technical means, whether you've given thought to them, to enhance the capability of UNEPS, which may also give certain entities which could be, that might become advocates of this idea. We move from, there's a rural county emergency measures office that's purchased some drones so that in forest fires and things, they can see what's going on. And then all the way up at satellite imagery, when Bob Ray was trying to get evidence on the Myanmar persecution of the Uyghurs, he from Maxar Corporation bought satellite imagery. So I'm wondering if you've given any thought to what sort of technical support for situational awareness or intelligence would be needed. And here, in terms of being subversive, I'm wondering we could approach like the Canadian Space Agency, which has been trying to help pull in space assets for civilian uses, or here for international security. So drones to satellites to whatever. Have you given consideration to what tools might be helpful to the UNEPS?
Well, yeah, but I gave consideration to the tools. Last time was 2 years ago, and drones have become much bigger in the last 2 years. And I think it's a really good idea because it could be very much more cost effective. And you might even attract support for it. So I'm open to the idea of looking at situational awareness and high tech surveillance, satellites, whatever. And it seems to be the way of the future. Although I'm not sure I really want to go toward the offensive capabilities of drones. That's still a touchy area. And but overall, you know, adding high tech, I have no problem with that. I'm very much in favor of situational awareness. Walter and I once did something together on situational awareness and looking at different technologies to enhance UN peace operations. So, yeah, thank you. I will keep it open and probably develop a file. Fair enough.
Lots of interesting discussion here. I think I'm going to turn it over to Norbert DaCosta, our branch president, in just a moment, but remind you that we're a volunteer organization. We depend on donations to cover our minor overheads. So I'm just putting now in the chat a way you can support the organization if you wish. But Norbert, you have something to say.
Thanks, John. Thank you very much, Dr. Langille, for this excellent presentation today. It certainly clarified for me UNEPS and how it differs from the Blue Beret. I do see this as a game changer. I see, for example, how UNEPS or something like UNEPS could make a big difference in Haiti, where the Blue Berets have not. For example, negotiate with the government of Haiti and the Dominican Republic to put in a blockade, both sea and land and air, so that no arms can come into Haiti except to their to the government, the military and police. So that sort of thing, I think, is made possible with an organization such as the UNEPS, and it is a game changer. The last thing I want to do is talk about how we can help the idea to get traction. There was a lot of talk on the there was something you brought up about a petition, an online petition. And the government of Canada does have an online petition site where if we follow the proper procedure successfully, the petition gets taken up by the government. And it's something that we can offer to work with you on to develop a petition. And using the numbers that we have in the World Federalist Movement, and not just the Toronto branch, but also the national organization, and well-wishers, many of whom are on this call, we could go through that process, put in a petition, and try to get it into the government of Canada so that they can be, it gets discussed in Parliament and get some more visibility. That's an offer that I'd like to take up with you, if that's okay.
That would be wonderfully appreciated. And I think it's a brilliant idea. Last year, similarly, I had Norman Solomon, who directs Roots Action in the United States, say he was keen on the idea, but he wanted me to develop a petition first. Well, I'm not that good at that. And I drafted several of them. So they're still available if at all helpful. And I'm sure Norman would be thrilled to pick it up and run with it, even do it jointly with you. And well, his audience is several million. So it might actually be even good for WFMC Toronto branch to align with it as a co-sponsor. You know, being an old guy, I'm sort of, well, I should concede I suck at social media.
No, I'm not talking about social media.
Yeah,
I was
know,
talking about
petitions
yes.
Too.
What I could do is we could take it offline. I'll send you a form, and you know, between you, John, and myself, we can complete the form and work out the process to get through Parliament.
And it is just that it's a process that takes a couple days, and having a couple extra minds would make a world of difference. So thank you very much. I think it's got huge potential, and if one or two work, then we can hit a dozen actually, because there are lots of venues to have these out and moving, and there's no question that they have a big impact.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Angelo. So before I pass it on to John, again, thank you on behalf of myself, the members of WFMC Toronto board, and everyone who's been on this call. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
John, would you?
Thank you, Norbert. And just as we close here, I need to remind everybody that we'll be posting the recording of this event on our YouTube channel and our website shortly, and we'll be preparing a printed short summary as well that will be on our website. The next meeting of the Toronto branch will be November 16th at 7 o'clock in the evening, where Peter Venton, one of our board members, will lead discussion entitled Reforming International Economic Institutions for a More Prosperous, Just, and Sustainable World Economic Order. So watch for announcements and registration details. Meanwhile,
One last thing before we go, for members of the World Federalist Movement across Canada who may be on this call, we've got our annual members meeting on October the 8th, I believe it is. So hopefully you'll be able to make it.
Thank you all. Thank you, Peter, for your insights and your lifelong advocacy on this, and all the challenges you've thrown at us. So lots of ideas. So we've got our plate full, and I'm sure we'll be talking in the next little while.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Many thanks.
Bye, everybody.
Once again.
Many thanks to all the guests.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Keep the faith.